All right. Good evening, everyone. I guess happy Tu B'Shvat. Thank you, Yehuda, for pointing it out. Tonight is technically already Tes Zayin Shvat, the 16th of Shvat, but today was Tu B'Shvat, and Tu B'Shvat, the two is actually a Tes and a Vav, which means 15. In Hebrew, it's the 15th day of Shvat, and it is called the New Year of the Trees, Rosh Hashanah Le'ilanot. We discussed it at length in the past, but it's always important to refresh our memories when it comes to holidays, especially joyous holidays, with many kids' songs associated with it. But anyhow, Tu B'Shvat, the technical idea of Tu B'Shvat is a legal one, and that is there are numerous Rosh Hashanahs throughout the year. The most famous Rosh Hashanah for the year, the new year, is when God judges all of mankind, and that is Rosh Hashanah on Tishrei, the first day of the Hebrew calendar. This Rosh Hashanah, this New Year's of the trees, is slightly different. The New Year of the trees is associated with various laws, the sabbatical law, the tithing law, the laws which are associated with trees and fields and so on, fruit trees start and begin. The year starts and ends on the 15th of Shabbat. So, for example, if someone has to count Arla, Arla is that a fruit tree which is planted for the first 3 years, one is not allowed to benefit from the fruit if fruit grows within the first 3 years. What's considered 3 years? And so 3 years is not 3 years to the day that you planted the tree, and 3 years is not 3 calendar years from the Jewish calendar. 3 years begins on Rosh Hashanah of the tree. So, for example, if you planted the tree 2 months ago, then comes Rosh Hashanah Le'ilanot, that's already considered 1 year. Next year on Tu B'Shvat is considered 2 years, and a year following is 3 years, if I recall correctly. And so various other laws connected with trees are associated. That's what the New Year is applicable. But it's an important holiday for us, especially even though we don't necessarily own many fruit trees and these laws aren't necessarily applicable to us. Nonetheless, the verse in Deuteronomy and Dvarim says, Ki ha'adam etz hasadeh. A person is like a tree. The sages say that a person is like, we use that verse to imply that a person is like a tree, and there are many lessons to be taken from a tree, to be studied from a tree, that one can use for inspiration for our own day-to-day lives. One is a very important one, and that is pertaining to a child's education. A tree, just as a tree, the younger it is, the more impressionable it is. A seedling can be impressed upon to grow in a certain fashion, which a grown tree would make it nearly impossible to accomplish that. So to a child at a very young age, even before a child is born, is very, very impressionable. And however we set the tone at that young, delicate age, that's the type of person that child will grow into. And so it's very important to give the younger generation a proper Jewish education. Another important lesson that we can take from the tree is that a beautiful tree is one that gives forth beautiful, juicy, tasty fruit. And the way such a tree can produce such fruit is by having solid roots deep into the ground, that's nourished properly, that's nurtured properly, and then it can give forth such beautiful fruit. A person is the same way. We have to have our roots firmly implanted in the ground of Torah and mitzvahs, in the ground of our emunah and bitachon, faith and trust in the Almighty, in our study of Torah. And then we can bear beautiful fruits, which is the fulfillment of the commandments and the affecting those around us, to do more positivity and to have a greater effect on those around us. And we can do that by having firm roots in the ground. And one final important point is the Rebbe points out that we celebrate the 15th of Shvat, Tu B'Shvat, in the winter time, when, at least in California, we don't see it that much on the West Coast, but on the East Coast, the trees are all barren. There's not even any leaves, and so it can look dark and gloomy. Nonetheless, we celebrate the new year of the trees, knowing that's now when the trees are setting in their roots even deeper and are nurturing and getting from the water until it's able to, as the spring rolls around, um, produce its beautiful fruit. And so too in life, we can reach these points in time which seem gloomy, they seem tough, they seem hard and challenging. Nonetheless, we have to take a lesson from the tree and know that these challenging times is really how and where we are nurturing and setting in our roots even deeper, revealing deeper aspects of our self that we did not even know we possess, to enable us to not only overcome and survive the challenges, but to thrive as a result of the challenges. So we should take these lessons from Tu B'Shvat and run with them. The custom on Tu B'Shvat is to eat fruits specifically from the 7 species that Israel was blessed with, is blessed with. The 7 species are wheat, barley, olives, dates, figs, and grapes, dates, grapes, figs, and um, pomegranates. And so the custom is to eat the 5 fruits of the 7 species, as well as to eat a new fruit, a fruit which we haven't had since the prior season, and to make a blessing, Shehechiyanu, thanking God to bring us this day to enjoy this fruit, and in general to eat as many fruits as possible to celebrate the new year of the trees, as well as there is an old custom mentioned by the sages to eat what we call buxer, carob, the fruit of a carob tree, and that is to commemorate a fruit that a miracle was performed with. And the miracle was in the time of when the Romans did not allow the Jewish people to study Torah, and Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai had to hide away in a cave for many, many years, together with his son, Rabbi Elazar. There was no food and no water. Miraculously, a stream appeared, as well as a carob tree. And that is how he survived for 13 years in a cave in the middle of the forest, in the middle of nowhere, with miraculous carob tree. And so to commemorate that miracle, to commemorate a fruit with which a miracle was performed, it's customary to eat a carob as well. Thanks to, I'm not sure who planted them, I guess the city many, many years ago. We have beautiful carob trees on Indianapolis and Keishan, between Keishan and Grandview and Inglewood. There are about 8 to 10 carob trees, and so every year it became a tradition in our family. We go and we pick some carob off those trees on the street to enjoy. This year, I guess they're not in season yet. They're not ripe. They were great and green, but nonetheless, we had to fulfill the custom. All right. So that is with the holiday of the tree. So happy Tu B'Shvat, and let's all take those lessons and run with them. Moving right along to this week's Torah portion. The Torah portion is the Torah portion of Beshalach, and it continues the story of the Jewish people leaving Egypt and the splitting of the Red Sea. And following the splitting of the Red Sea, which came about when the Jewish people were between a rock and a hard place or a soft place, they were standing in front of the water. The Egyptians were gaining ground on them, and they prayed to God, pleaded with God, what should we do? And God said, no one told you to stop. Keep on going. And so Nachshon ben Aminadav was his name. He was the first one, and he jumped into the water, and he went until the water reached his neck. And suddenly the water miraculously split, and the Jewish people followed suit and went through the Yam Suf, Sea of Reeds. And we all know the ending of the story. The Egyptians followed and were all drowned. Following that, the Jewish people emerged on the other side on dry land, safe, happy, and they sang a song of praise to God. And we sing that song, we say that song in our prayers every single morning, the prayer of Az Yashir. That's in this week's Torah portion. Following that, we have the story of the manna from heaven. And including in the manna from heaven is a very somewhat, I wouldn't say very, but a relatively unknown law in the Torah. And that is the law of Tichum Shabbos. We know on Shabbos there are various things that we're not supposed to do, prohibitions. There's, everyone knows you can't turn on a light on Shabbos, and you can. Someone told me today doesn't understand how rabbis do Zoom. on Shabbos, and I obviously explained that we have Zoom programs, just not on Shabbos, because Zoom we can't use on Shabbos. And so there are certain things that we know we can't do on Shabbos. Various prohibitions. But believe it or not, there's something called Tchum Shabbos. There is a boundary on Shabbos. There's a limit on how far it is permitted to walk on Shabbos. So for those cross-country hikers, it's a very practical law. And back in the olden days, it was a lot more practical on a regular basis. And even for us, when we go to the mountains, as we shall soon see, if we go camping, if we go touring, and so on in villages, it is a very practical law. And that's what we're going to discuss tonight, this law called Tchum Shabbos, the boundary of Shabbos, how far we're allowed to walk on Shabbos. And if we think of it, it's quite curious, because walking on Shabbos is a favorite Shabbos pastime, to take a Shabbos stroll. As a matter of fact, in Belgium, in Antwerp, there is a park which is almost officially dubbed the Chullens Park. And that's because the park is teeming with people walking Shabbos afternoon with their families, with their spouses, with their parents, and enjoying a nice stroll in the park on a Shabbos afternoon from the Jewish community. And so what can be wrong with walking on Shabbos? Walking seems to be part of the essence of Shabbos, a leisure walk, an enjoyable time. And so we're going to delve into the technical aspect of the law, the why of the law, but then also the what and the why, but the deeper why as well. The deeper why as well is, what does the boundaries of Shabbos teach us about the boundaries of life, the boundaries of our day-to-day involvement in the world around us? And so let's get right into it. Pull it up and we'll begin from a quote in this week's Torah portion. Pull it up, just a moment. There we go. Yep, we got the same problem. Fix it. There we go. Okay. So we'll get right into it. What is this idea of Tchum Shabbos, and what does it tell us in our day-to-day lives and boundaries? And this is the quote from this week's Torah portion. This is pertaining to the story of the manna, where the Jewish people in the desert every single day had food. They had food that fell from heaven, literally. And it was called the man, Hebrew manna in English. And it would fall early in the morning, and all the Jewish people would leave their tents, leave the encampment, and go and gather the manna. And the first Friday that the manna fell, they arrived Friday morning into gathering the manna. They came home, and lo and behold, their containers that they used to gather the manna suddenly miraculously doubled. There was 2 portions in each container. And they came to Moses saying, "What's going on?" And Moses explained that in honor of Shabbos, we do not go out of the encampment to gather the manna. We collect the double portion on Friday in honor of the Shabbos, and on Shabbos we do not collect it. And associated with that is the 2 challahs that we use every single holiday, every single Shabbos meal, as well as the covering of the challah. Because the manna fell, there was first a light covering of dew on the ground. Following that, the manna fell, and then on top of the manna as well, there was a second covering of dew, kind of to keep the manna safe and clean. And to commemorate those 2 coverings of dew is why we have a Shabbos tablecloth. On top of that, the challah, and on top of the challah, a special challah covering. And so came Shabbos morning, and there were some rabble rousers who tried to test God's limit. And they went ahead early in the morning before dawn and they sprinkled a lot of manna, their own manna, and crumbs and other foods on the outskirts of the town. And they went ahead and they announced to some people and some friends of theirs and followers of theirs to say, look, Moses said there's not going to be any manna. Come with us. We'll show you that there's manna. And they arrived and there was nothing there because the birds came and the birds ate everything that they had put out shortly before. And so following that, God rebukes these people and then tells the Jewish people this verse. How long will you refuse to observe my commandments and my teachings? See, God has given us the Shabbat. Therefore, on the sixth day, he gives you bread for 2 days. Let each man remain in his place. No man should leave his place on the seventh day. At first brush, it just seems like God's telling them not to leave because there's not going to be any manna. But the sages take it a step further, and in the words of Maimonides, based on this verse, no man should leave his place on the seventh day. The term place refers to the techum, the boundary, the range beyond the city limits into which we may not venture on the Shabbos. In other words, our sages understood that Moshe was telling the Jewish people that today is Shabbos. On Shabbos, it's forbidden to stroll past the Techum Shabbos, to stroll past the boundary. They're to settle in the place and not to stroll out of camp. How far are these boundaries? How far may a person walk on Shabbos until where can he walk? And then he has to stop. And so Maimonides continues. The Torah did not explicitly state the extent of this range. The sages, however, transmitted a tradition that the range extends to 12 mil beyond the city, a measure that corresponds with the size of a Jewish camp in the desert. 12 mil is a Talmudic measurement. If I'm not mistaken, it's about 7 miles. Thus, Moses, our teacher, instructed, do not go out beyond the camp. Our sages further reduced the range from 12 mil and ruled that a person may only venture 2,000 amma beyond the city. Now, an amma's debate of what exactly the size is, it's roughly between 18 and 22 inches each. But so the 2,000 amma is about 3,158 feet. So not even a mile, say about 2/3 of a mile. So our sages rule that a person may only venture 2,000 amma beyond the city. They chose this range because it is the size of the pasture land that the Torah allocates to all cities, and thus the space is associated with the city. Later on in the Torah discusses various sizes of land associated with other laws and mentions that the space outside of a city that's associated with the city, the pasture land, which is associated with each respective city, is 2,000 amma. About 2/3 of a mile. And so as such, the sages took from there and they said, so too over here, the land which is associated with the city that may be walked on Shabbos is 2/3 of a mile. But beyond that point, one is prohibited from walking on Shabbos. Now, it's not that we're only allowed to walk 3,200 feet. Right? Some of us walk more than 3,200 feet every Shabbos. Some of us walk more than 3,200 feet every day. So what's it talking about? If you notice, it mentions 2,000 amma beyond the city. And Maimonides continues. It follows that a person may walk freely throughout the city, even if it is as large as Nineveh, irrespective of whether it is surrounded by a wall. In addition, we may walk 2,000 amma in any direction beyond the city's limits. When calculating the city's limits, a square is drawn around the entire city. Thus, the areas between its furthest corners are included. So, what Maimonides is referring to is as follows. If you have a city, it can be as large as Los Angeles, very large city. You can walk freely throughout the whole city, even if it takes you 10 hours. Doesn't make a difference. Where are you not allowed to walk? Once you leave the city limits and there's just farmland. So say if you're walking in Los Angeles, it's not so common. Where do you have just farmland outside of the city limits? As soon as you leave the city limits, you have another city. But if you go in, upstate New York, or if you go out of in Ventura County or in San Bernardino County, and you leave some of the little cities that are there, you leave a city, you just have farmland. When you're walking from those farmlands, there is a limit on how much you can walk. But where does the city limit end? So according to Torah, the city limit ends. We make a perfect square around the city. That means if you look at the city of Los Angeles, and you have one area on its northern border, or southern border, or its eastern border, you have the southeast part is only up till here, but the northeast, the northeast part only goes as far as this, but the northwest part goes till here. So is it 2,000 amma from here, 2,000 amma from here? Can you walk 2,000 amma one direction, which may be parallel to that same city? So what Maimonides is explaining is that you go north to the farthest, the most northern point of the city, and then you make a perfectly straight horizontal line. That's where the 2,000 amma begin. And so it could be that you're leaving the city limits even 4 miles before. But if that city continues north on the west side of the city, so it's still considered in the city on the east side of the city, because on the west side of the city, it's still the actual city. So once you have a square that encompasses the entire city, beyond that square, you may only walk 2,000 amma, 2/3 of a mile. Past 2/3 of a mile, if there are no more houses, if you reach a point past 2/3 of the mile, there aren't any houses, now you've reached beyond the city limits and one is not allowed to walk past that space. So as I mentioned here in Los Angeles, it's not so practical because how many of us are walking outside of city limits where there aren't any more houses 2/3 of a mile? At least I'm not. Most of us aren't. But if we go up north, or we go to the mountains, or we go to San Bernardino County, and we're hanging out, or we're camping out in the mountains, Big Bear, wherever it may be, it can become very practical, because it's only 2/3 of a mile, and then we can't walk anymore. And so that is the law about, which is called Tichum Shabbos, the boundaries of Shabbos. Those are the boundaries of Shabbos. And Maimonides actually continues and discusses if you're camping out in the middle of nowhere. One who spends Shabbos in a barn, in the desert, in a corral, in a cave, or in a similar type of private domain, may walk through its entire space and may continue to the limits of a square extending 2,000 amma in every direction from that domain. Similarly, one who spends the Shabbos in an open valley may walk to the limits of a square extending 2,000 cubits in every direction from the place at which he is located at the commencement of the Shabbos. He doesn't have any house, he doesn't have anything. He's standing in the middle of a valley. It's from that point that he's standing, he can walk 2,000 cubits in each direction, 2/3 of a mile. One who is walking in an open valley and does not know how far his Shabbos range extends may take 2,000 ordinary steps. This is his Shabbos range. In other words, he can go before Shabbos and measure with his car, or check online on Google where exactly 2/3 of a mile is. That, in such a scenario, is only allowed to go 2,000 steps from where he is. Now, there are many, many laws associated with this specific general prohibition. It's quite complex, and there's an entire tractate in the Talmud called Tractate Eruvin, which is associated with this law and various other laws about domains on Shabbos. And but this is the basic outline of the law. And this is according to Maimonides, who feels that it's an edict from the Torah, from that verse in this week's Torah portion, that tells us a person is not allowed to leave their space. And the rabbis interpreted space to mean this limit of 2,000 cubits. But the basic is from the law of the Torah that one isn't allowed to leave their space. Rashi, on the other hand, follows a different opinion, which says that this isn't a biblical law, rather it's a rabbinic enactment, and they used the law in the Torah, the verse in the Torah, as kind of a backup support for their ruling. Words of Rashi, this week's Torah portion: no man should leave his place. These are the 2,000 amma of the Shabbos range, but this is not explicit for the Shabbos range. Rather, it is a rabbinic enactment. This verse was primarily intended to reprimand the gatherers of the manna. In other words, the rabbis, as we shall soon see, enacted for some reason this rule of not leaving your space on Shabbos, and for support, they used this verse, but not that this verse is the source, as Maimonides seems to say that this verse is the actual source, and that was the Torah's intention by saying this verse, that one isn't allowed to leave. Either way, now that we know the primary reasons, the primary point, of this law, now let's try to explore its reason. Why? Why shall we not pass these boundaries? Why shall we not pass them? Why shall we not leave them? What is the purpose of this rabbinic enactment? So the reason behind various enactments is as follows. Just a general overview of the laws of Shabbos. The laws of Shabbos, what's permitted and what's prohibited, is in the Torah. The Torah tells us that we have to do certain things and we're not allowed to do others on Shabbos. The ones that we are prohibited from doing on Shabbos are ideas which the Torah deems creation, actions that are creative actions. Why is that the category? Because God wants us to rest from creation on the seventh day, on the day of rest, just as God rested from creation on the seventh day. So for 6 days, God created, and for seventh he rested. We create for 6 days. Obviously, it's not ex nihilo, but it's creation nonetheless. And on the seventh day, we should rest. For example, how do we create? We create from paper and ink, cohesive literature. We create from seeds, trees. We create from all different types of intelligence, money, right? We go to work, we create. It's all types of creations. And so God rested from creating on Shabbos, so too we rest from creation on Shabbos. And our sages broke down the acts of creation into 39 categories, 39 items, which include plowing, planting, baking, lighting a fire, carrying in the public domain, building, destroying, writing, erasing, tearing, sewing, and so on and so forth. There are 39 general items that are considered creating according to the Torah, as enumerated by the sages in Tractate Shabbos. And there are many sub-details within each one of those 39 categories. In addition to the 39 categories, in addition to these 39 acts of creation, our sages added further restrictions. Why they add these further restrictions? So in the words of Maimonides, the Torah tells us to cease during the Shabbos. This means that we must cease even from activities that are not included in the categories of forbidden labors. The Torah left the definition of the scope of this commandment to the sages, who forbade many activities under the rubric of Shavut. Shavut means resting, cease. Some activities are forbidden because they resemble the forbidden labors, while other activities are forbidden lest they lead one to commit a forbidden labor. So if you notice, there's a key point that Maimonides points out here, or rather 2 points. The 2 points he mentions or even before we get to those 2 points, there's a general idea that Maimonides is mentioning. And if anyone has any questions, or if it's getting a little bit too detailed, please drop your question or concern in the chat box so I can explain accordingly. Maimonides is explaining that beyond the 39 labors, the 39 creative actions, which are biblically prohibited on Shabbos, so as to ensure that we rest on the Shabbos from creation, just as God rested, the rabbis took it a step further, because the verse tells us that we shall cease during the Shabbos, aside from those 39 prohibitions. What shall we cease doing on the Shabbos? What shall we rest from doing, which is aside from those 39 categories? The Torah left it up to the sages to define. And what did the sages do? They enacted a category called Shavut. And what Shavut is, as Maimonides points out towards the end, these 2 important points. They included in this category of prohibitions of Shavut 2 types of items. One type, because it strongly resembles a forbidden labor. And so if we allow this, although it is inherently permitted, if it would be allowed, someone may come to make that association and say, if this is allowed, then I must be allowed to do the other thing as well. And so the rabbis prohibited from doing those items, and we'll give an example in a moment. And the second point that Maimonides mentions is that lest they lead one to commit a forbidden labor. It's an extra barrier. And what would be an example? An example is that on Shabbos, we are not allowed to reap. And so including in reaping would be, we're not allowed to pick apples off a tree. Can't pick apples off a tree. So the rabbi said, if according to the Torah, the biblical law is that we're not allowed to pick apples from a tree, then the rabbis enacted that we're also not allowed to remove the honey from a honeycomb. Why? Although removing a honey from a honeycomb is permitted inherently on Shabbos, biblically it is permitted, nonetheless it goes into the category of shut for the first reason that Maimonides mentioned. Namely, it is very similar to the other item which is prohibited. So removing an apple from a tree is prohibited. So the rabbi said removing honey from its source, a honeycomb, is also prohibited, because if we allow to remove honey from a honeycomb on Shabbos, some may come to say, look, if I'm allowed to remove honey from its original source, then why can I remove apples from their original source? And they won't make that differentiation that honey isn't connected to its honeycomb, whereas an apple is connected to its source, the tree. So that's an example of a rule that the rabbis enacted under this umbrella of Shavut, following the first reason that Maimonides gave. Following the second, in that same law of not being allowed to pick an apple from a tree, the rabbis enacted that one isn't permitted to smell an apple while it is still on the tree. Because someone who's smelling an apple while it's still on the tree, that may lead them to intentionally or unintentionally pull the apple from the tree. This smells so delicious, let me get a better smell from it. By mistake, the apple comes off the tree. Or it smells so delicious, I may as well bite into it. Pulls the apple off the tree. And so because the rabbis wanted to, the sages of the Talmud wanted to ensure that no one comes to transgress a prohibition from the Torah, a biblical prohibition, namely pulling an apple off the tree, the rabbis instituted this added step of Shavus in this category. In other words, the leading category of you're not allowed to do step one because it may lead you to step two. Those are the 2 categories of laws that Maimonides mentions that we're not allowed to do on Shabbos, and those are rabbinic enactments. So now let's get back to Tichum Shabbos. According to Rashi, that we mentioned, that does not say that it's a biblical prohibition. Walking the range of Shabbos is not a biblical prohibition. According to Rashi, it's a rabbinic enactment. Why? Why this rabbinic enactment? How does Tchum Shabbos, the boundary of Shabbos, fit the criteria. It doesn't fit the criteria of it will lead one to do a biblical prohibition. What biblical prohibition will walking beyond the boundary of Shabbos lead one to do? Or it doesn't fit the second criteria of it's similar to a law which is prohibited on Shabbos. So if it doesn't fit the two criteria laid out by Maimonides, those are the two criteria why the rabbis enacted these extra prohibitions, then why did the rabbis enact this prohibition of Tichum Shabbos? The answer is there's something else. There's another category in the laws of Shabbos. So we have the Milachot, the 39 biblically prohibited creative actions on Shabbos. Then we have the rabbinic enactment called Shavut, which is done for the one of two criteria, either because it is similar to a biblical prohibition or because it will lead to a biblical prohibition, so the rabbis prohibited it. But there's a third one. And what's that third category? In the words of Maimonides, based on a verse. There are activities that are forbidden on the Shabbos, though they don't resemble the forbidden labors, nor do they lead to their performance. If so, says Maimonides, why are these activities forbidden? Because it is written in the verse, if you restrain your feet because of the Shabbos, and refrain from pursuing your desires on my holy day, and you should honor it by refraining from following your ordinary ways, attending to your wants, and discussing mundane matters. Accordingly, it is forbidden to tend to our concerns on the Shabbos, or even to talk about them, to consult a partner on which merchandise should be sold the next day, or which should be purchased, how this building should be constructed, or which merchandise should be taken to a particular place. Such discussions are included in the prohibition against discussing mundane matters. What's Maimonides saying here? Post in the chat box if you've ever heard the expression Mishtav Shabbos Gret. It's a Yiddish expression, and it means it's not something we talk about on Shabbos. So an old joke that we'll get to the joke after we explain what Maimonides is saying. The concept expressed over here is the concept of the spirit of the day of Shabbos. Like we mentioned before, what was the purpose of Shabbos? God created Shabbos or instituted Shabbos because God wanted Shabbos to be a day of rest, but not so much rest as in relaxing and sleeping all day, a day of rest from mundane things and a day of real activity in holiness. It's our time to connect with godliness. It's our time to connect with our values, to study extra Torah, to do extra prayer, to connect with our community, with our family. That's what Shabbos is for. That's the spirit of Shabbos, to connect with God, not just to rest, but to connect with God, with our family, with our community. Even things which are permitted on Shabbos, for example, talking. Talking is a permitted action on Shabbos. You can technically talk about whatever you want. But if all we talk about will be mundane topics, where's the Shabbos in that? As we say in Yiddish, where's the gefühl of holiness? It's gone, it's missing. And so the verse, which was just quoted by Maimonides, the verse references that on Shabbos, we should take it a step further. And we should refrain from talking, doing, or even walking in permissible ways which are about or connected to things which are not permissible. And the example mentioned here is about selling. Obviously, we're not allowed to do business on Shabbos, but how about talking about my merchandise or talking about my business, how it went this week and how it's going to go next week, and talk with my accountant about different plans for the next week and how we should structure whatever we're talking about. How about talking with my graphic designer about what my design should be? All those items are not in the spirit of Shabbos. Shabbos, we should be talking about what we studied in the Torah. Shabbos, we should be talking about what is Judaism's position on X, Y, and Z. Shabbos, we should be talking about our family, our children, our parents, our siblings, our spouses. Shabbos, we should be spending extra time in prayer. That's what Shabbos is about, not about talking about our business, and not about doing things which will lead to losing the spirit of Shabbos. And that is the rationale behind the rabbinic enactment of walking beyond 2,000 cubits, 2/3 of a mile. You see, if you need to walk, take a walk in the Cholent Park, like we mentioned in the beginning, because you're relaxing and taking a nice walk with your family. And you're discussing different Shabbos topics, different Torah topics, different holiday topics, whatever it may be. That's a walk that's in the spirit of the Shabbos. But you know, taking a walk that's beyond the city limits, so far that it's 2/3 of a mile out of the city limits, that's already not just a walk associated with the spirit of Shabbos. That's because you want to do exercise. Or that's because you're working yourself up in a sweat, which isn't permitted on Shabbos. It's not in the spirit of Shabbos. It's not conducive to the holiness of Shabbos. And that's why the rabbi said walking beyond the boundaries of Shabbos isn't conducive to the spirit of Shabbos, and so it is prohibited. That's the rationale behind it. That's the reason why the rabbis enacted this prohibition. And in the words of the Aruch HaShulchan, a codifier of Jewish law from the 19th century, he says so as much with respect to the Shabbos boundaries. It appears that our sages did not want Jews to stroll about excessively on the Shabbos as one does during the weekday. For it is proper to plug into the delight of the Shabbos and engage in Torah study. You take a 5-mile run every day, don't do that on Shabbos. You do exercise in the gym for a day, don't do that on Shabbos. Interestingly enough, I noticed today there's an app called a pedometer. Some of you may have it. It's to see how many steps you take a day. And the default setting is that you take 10,000 steps a day. And they have these different types of medals that you get if you actually walk the amount of steps you're supposed to each day. And so if you walk 6 consecutive a week or 30 or 100 consecutive days, you get a medal. You reach the milestone by walking over 10,000 steps every single day. But what happens as a Jew? It's Shabbos, and if we want to do such a thing, we want to get that 100-day medal. It's never possible because we can never do 100 consecutive days because we have Shabbos in between, and we can't walk 10,000 feet on Shabbos. Not sure who owns pedometer, but you know what they put in there? They have a little toggle in the settings, and you can turn it on for a rest day. If you have 6 consecutive days, the 7th day can be considered a rest day, and it won't lose from your consecutive days. And so you can still get 100 consecutive days, even if every 7th day you don't walk anything. Because they must know that on Shabbos, we don't do exercise. On Shabbos, we don't walk 10,000 feet. On Shabbos, it's a time to connect to God. It's a time to connect to our families. Now back to the joke. It's a famous joke where a guy comes to shul and turns to his friend and he says, so for the joke, another introduction. I'm not sure if there's legal basis to it, but it's very common if someone starts speaking about something which isn't in the spirit of Shabbos, they say it kind of with a disclaimer, Nishtav Shabbos Geret. This isn't something that we should be talking about on Shabbos, but nonetheless, I'm still mentioning it for whatever reason, and just like important or in a passing way, I'm going to mention it. I'm not sure if there's any legal basis for that, but such is the custom. So this guy comes into the shul and he turns to his friend and he says, "Look, Nishtav Shabbos Geret, but I have the Mercedes I'm looking to sell." So the guy turns to me and says, "Nishtav Shabbos Geret, how much are you looking to sell it for?" He says, "Nishtav Shabbos Geret, I'm looking to sell it for $30,000. He says, "Nishtav Shabbos Geret, how many years do you have it? How many miles does it have?" And so on and so forth. All right, they finished that conversation, and the owner of the Mercedes walks off. Comes the evening, the afternoon prayers, and his friend walks over to him, and he says, "So tell me, Nishtav Shabbos Geret, can we talk about the car?" And he says, "I'm sorry, Nishtav Shabbos Geret, I sold it already." The idea of the joke is kind of, people are using the loopholes, would use the loopholes so far that they actually go ahead and do the prohibition. So now that we understand the general concept of the laws of the boundary of Shabbos, as well as the reasoning for the law, and that is to be in the keeping of Shabbos. Now we're going to move to the deeper why, the deeper concept of how these boundaries of Shabbos can give us some insight on the boundaries of life. And we'll begin with a statement from the Sefer HaChinuch, which is a 14th century authoritative book on the 613 commandments. And in his explanation for the law of Shabbos, he says as follows. The root idea of this commandment is to withdraw from our engagements in honor of this day and affix within our souls the belief in the creation of the world, which is the string that draws the foundations of our faith. That we should remember for one day each week that the world was created in 6 separate days, and that on the 7th day, nothing was created. When everyone rests for one day each week, and someone asks why we rest, the answer, that we rest because God created the world in 6 days and rested on the 7th, reinforces the true faith among us all. So in other words, it's not just because God rested, so we are resting. Why did God command that we should rest on the 7th day? Because he rested. Why is that? That's to reinforce our faith in the concept that God was the creator of the world and is constantly, as explained in Kabbalah and Chassidus, the creator of the world. And in order for us to give us that, in order for us to have that moment in time to stop and think about it, God is the one that created the world. God commanded us to stop on Shabbos, to recognize that God created the world. And so we create in the 6 days. God rested on the 7th day, and we rest on the 7th day. So the idea of Shabbos is to recognize that everything, including nature, was created by God. And that is the idea of adhering to Shabbos. If so, what happens when, God forbid, one desecrates the Shabbos? What happens if we desecrate the Shabbos and we do one of those creative actions? Shabbos stops being a day which is exclusive for godliness, and we're introducing a note of mundaneness which profanes the holiness of Shabbos. The words of the Rebbe. The idea behind the restriction against work on the Shabbos is that by performing creative activities, we form a space in the Shabbos that is devoid of holiness. That is to say, our activity introduces something inappropriate, something impure into Shabbos. The Hebrew word for profanes the Shabbos, desecrates the Shabbos, is mechalel. The Hebrew word for void is halal. They are etymologically related, and in Hebrew, etymological relations imply conceptual relations. If so, when one desecrates the Shabbos, what's occurring? They are creating a void of holiness within the Shabbos. They are introducing unholiness, impurity, into the purity and the holiness of Shabbos. We're taking something which is exclusively God and removing its exclusivity. We're introducing something impure into that space of Shabbos. We're opening a void of holiness in the space of Shabbos, in the space of total holiness. Right? If you have a bubble that you're blowing, and some of these bubbles you can actually put your finger in, and the bubble doesn't pop, the bubble still stays there, but now your finger's in the bubble. That's what's happening. We have this bubble of Shabbos. Something's going into that bubble. It's creating a void of that holy space, a void of unholiness. So by introducing unholiness into Shabbos is one kind of desecration. But then there's another kind of desecration. And that's when we take Shabbos out of its holiness and bring it into the realm of holiness. In other words, not taking unholiness and bringing it into holiness, but the other way around, taking holiness and bringing into unholiness. And that's the philosophy behind the boundaries of Shabbos. The words of the Rebbe. The reason for the prohibition against walking beyond the Shabbos range is not that we introduce a weekday element into the Shabbos. Rather, right, as we explained, it isn't inherently forbidden. Rather, it is that we export the Shabbos into the realm of unholiness. This is because within every Jew, even one who is boorish and completely ignorant, the radiance of the Shabbos is aglow. And when we step beyond the Shabbos boundaries, we bring the holiness of the Shabbos that is within us into the realm of unholiness. So in other words, every single Jew, Shabbos is not just a time, it's also a space. That space is in each and every single Jew. We are Shabbos. We personify Shabbos on the day of Shabbos. And by us walking out of the boundary of Shabbos, what are we doing in turn? We're taking that holiness of Shabbos and bringing it into a place of unholiness, of impurity. And we are desecrating the Shabbos. So one way of desecration, which is by doing an activity on Shabbos, which is prohibited, that's bringing unholiness into the holiness of Shabbos. By leaving the boundaries on Shabbos, we are taking the holiness of Shabbos and bringing it outside into the realm of unholiness. This idea is the way it is in relation to Shabbos. But as we mentioned in the beginning, that by understanding the philosophy behind the boundaries of Shabbos, we can now understand the philosophy of the boundaries of life. What are the boundaries of life? The boundaries of life that we're referring to here is the boundaries of the holy and the unholy. The boundaries of the soul and the body, the boundaries of what's weekday in our life and what's Shabbos in our life. You see, every day we have Shabbos and every day we have weekday. What's the Shabbos in our daily lives? The Shabbos in our daily lives is a time that we pray, a time that we go to synagogue. Right now, we are in our Shabbos of our Thursday because we're studying Torah. That is the holiness of our day. That is the Shabbos of our day. What's the weekdays of our days? What's the weekday of today? When we drank our coffee this morning, when we eat lunch, when we eat breakfast, when we take a walk outside, that's the weekday of our day. So the Shabbos of our day is every time we do something holy. The weekday of our day is every time we do something mundane. What does the boundaries of Shabbos teach us? The boundaries of Shabbos teach us as follows. We have two sets of boundaries. We have the boundaries of action. We have the boundaries of walking. The boundaries of action were what we are allowed to do on Shabbos and what we're prohibited from doing on Shabbos. Right? We're not allowed to bake on Shabbos. What happens if one bakes on Shabbos, as we explained? We're creating a void of unholiness, of holiness, filling it with unholiness in Shabbos. That's the desecration of Shabbos. The same is like that in our lives. What is that? That's when we allow the weekday of our day to infringe upon the holiness of our day. We have a set time to study Torah. We have a set time to do prayers. We're supposed to be praying 3 times a day. Instead of praying 3 times a day, we allow that unholiness to infringe upon it. And we say, you know what? I got to go to work. I don't have time to pray. I don't have time to study Torah. We are now having the unholiness of our day infringe upon the holiness and create a void within the holiness. Also within ourselves, we have the holy aspects. We have the Shabbos aspects within ourselves. Our soul, our minds, which is where the soul rests. If we allow the mundane to infringe upon those aspects of ourselves, we're allowing the weekday to infringe upon the Shabbos, the unholy to infringe upon the holy. In the words of the Rebbe, and a practical example of that, when we introduce worldly thinking into our minds, and our minds is the Shabbos element within us, a void and emptiness is introduced that doesn't sense or feel godliness. For if we knew and felt the truth that only God's blessing can make us wealthy, and that our efforts are merely to form a vessel for his blessing, we would not invest our brains into business by scheming creative machinations and tactics that are in any event ineffective, for only God's blessing can grant success. On the contrary, becoming too engrossed in our many business affairs distracts us from Torah and serving God, which in turn prevents us from becoming proper vessels for the divine's blessing. So not that we shouldn't go to work, God forbid. Now, there's a famous good omen of reading the Torah portion associated with the manna for success in business. And so there was a Hasidic Rebbe who once said that it's a great omen until 9 o'clock. But 9 o'clock, get to work. Stop reading Torah portions. So in other words, there's an idea we got to go to work. We got to make a vessel for God's blessings. But it's just that, it's a vessel for God's blessings. Let's not get too involved. Let's make sure it doesn't infringe upon our other important responsibilities and more greater responsibilities of daily Torah study, of daily prayer, putting on tefillin, of keeping Shabbos, and so on and so forth. Because if we allow ourselves to get too engrossed, if we allow our mind to delve too deeply into all different sorts of business wheelings and dealings, we are now infringing the weekday. We are bringing the unholy into the holy. We are allowing our weekday to affect our Shabbos. And then it works the other way around. The other way around of the boundaries of Shabbos, the actual boundaries, the walking boundaries of Shabbos, of walking outside the boundaries, which we explained was taking Shabbos and bringing it into the mundane, which is prohibited. What's that in our daily lives? Words of the Rebbe. Even if we don't allow our business concerns to invade our inner Shabbos, we must remember that there is yet another restriction, the restriction against venturing beyond the boundary. That is to say, during our Shabbos moments, times reserved for Torah and mitzvahs, even the outer aspect of our being, such as our hands and feet, may not leave the boundaries to do something unrelated to Torah and mitzvahs. For the Torah must permeate our entire body, not just the mind. One might say, if during business I shouldn't get my mind too involved, it should just be my hands and feet, because my mind is my Shabbos. If so, the other way as well. That when I'm doing Shabbos with my mind and my speech, in other words, I'm doing the morning Torah study, or I'm sitting by my computer and studying Torah through Zoom, but my hands and feet can be doing something else. Let me go ahead and while I'm listening to a Torah class, let me clean the floors. While I'm doing my morning prayers, I'm home anyhow, let me watch the news or catch up on emails, because I know the words. So I'm going to say the words quickly, but while I'm saying the words, I'm thinking about sports, I'm thinking about other things. That's this idea. That's taking our hands and feet, even if our mind is fully occupied with Shabbos, but that's taking our hands and feet and walking out of our Shabbos. We're taking our Shabbos, our moments of our day, every day, which is moments of Shabbos. There are holy moments, there are times when we're supposed to be totally connected and exclusive for God. And we're taking that out of the domain of holiness, bringing it into the domain of weekday. And so this teaches us a lesson. Today's Torah portion teaches us the lesson that we have to remember the boundaries. And the boundaries are that when it's time to study Torah, we should remember nothing should infringe upon it. And we got to study Torah. When it's time to pray, we got to pray. And when it's time to do the mundane things, let's not get too involved in the mundane world. Let's do what we got to do and get out of there. Because who are we? We have Shabbos aspects to us. We have to remember those Shabbos aspects and keep them holy. We'll conclude with a story. The story the Talmud relates of a great sage, Elisha ben Avuya was his name, who was a master Torah scholar, but his heart was not in it. And so, after a while, Elisha ben Avuya became a heretic. He continued to know tremendous amounts of Torah and continued to study and had a tremendous wealth of understanding in Torah. But most scholars refused to learn from him because he was a heretic. He didn't fulfill any laws of the Torah. There was one exception, Rabbi Meir, the great Rabbi Meir, who's mentioned in almost every single page of the Talmud. He continued to learn from his teacher, Elisha ben Avuya, even in such a state. And the Talmud relates a story. One Shabbos, Rabbi Meir was sitting in the house of study in Tiberias and teaching when his teacher, Elisha, passed the study house on horseback, which is prohibited on Shabbos. They came and told Rabbi Meir, your teacher is outside. Rabbi Meir stopped the lecture and stepped out. They walked together for a while, Rabbi Meir walking and Elisha on his horse, and conversed in Torah. Elisha said to him, Meir, this is as far as you can go. We have reached the outer limits of the Shabbos range. So Meir replied, how do you know? Elisha replied, I have been counting my horse's steps and know that we have traveled 2,000 amma. So Meir said, you have so much wisdom. Would you not turn back? What was Meir telling him? They were walking and discussing Torah, but there was a very distinct difference between the two. Reb Meir was walking, not riding a horse, which is prohibited on Shabbos. Reb Meir was not going to venture beyond the boundary, whereas Elisha was going to venture beyond the boundary. And the Torah discussion wasn't going to change him. And so his body, the body of Elisha, was an entirely different realm. Not only was he violating the rabbinic restriction of riding a horse and creating a void within his own Shabbos, but he was also willing to venture beyond the boundary and bring Shabbos into the realm of unholiness. So Reb Meir said to Elisha, why don't you turn back, allow the Torah to permeate you, to permeate your hands and your feet? Why not stay within the boundary and allow the Torah to permeate your very being? At the end, Elisha actually repented, and apparently Reb Meir's words had their effect. And so we have to learn from this. We can't allow our business worries and concerns to permeate our minds and our hearts. We must respect the boundaries and not allow mundane worldliness to penetrate our inner Shabbos, our inner holiness. And similarly, we can't allow our Torah to be separated from the rest of our lifestyle. Just as in the boundary, we can't let our feet and hands to leave the boundary, so too our feet and hands. The mundane aspects of our life can also, and should also be infused with Shabbos, with holiness. So, we got a question.
Oh, no, you have a thank you.
Oh, thank you. There we go. So thank you all for joining. And